Hey
Hello.
everyone! Time for part 4 of this 2022 reading.
April is
recap.
afoot.
Yes, these are the books we read in April-ish.
Yeah, thereabouts.
April-ish. And once again, Mackie's gonna kick things off.
General area. Alright, so kicking things off, Scott Snyder has made a lot of appearances in this year's overall what we've read, or what I've read anyway.
I was like, I haven't read it.
Yeah. And we said I want to kick it off with Batman Last Night on Earth.
Okay.
Which is, again, another Elseworld. It's set into the far, far future where
Alright.
DC dystopia, right? And like sort of like Bruce is, you know, like what's going on, what's happening here. I really can't say anything more than just that it's set in like sort of like the far future and things are just really, really dystopic, because part of understanding what this new world that sort of like Bruce wakes up to is tied to sort of like the plot. I appreciated it. It was nice. It's not something that I was like, oh my god, that's, you know, it's like the Killing Joke. You have to read it. Even now, but I didn't really like Killing Joke. But at least everybody.
The Killing Joke was like.
It's I mean.
I feel like it's like just one of those pivotal ones because
yeah.
it's such a significant moment.
Yeah, it's a significant moment. Super crazy. It's not one of my favorites, but it's.
I mean, I wouldn't call it a favorite either.
Yeah, but here's the Blackest Night.
Oh, that one I'll call a favorite.
You know, standing ovations all. So it wouldn't fit that sort of like level, but is a nice Batman story, and Scott Snyder delivers, so I sort of appreciated that. Reign of X continues the saga. You know, Sword is in space now as an orbital platform, and there's some crazy shenanigans going on there. X Factor is out. They are still doing investigations, but this time they want to make sure that mutant deaths are valid.
Okay.
So you don't end up bringing somebody back to life that was technically still alive. It's this whole thing. And then of course, you know, we have a face-off between Psylocke and Betsy Braddock, who, you know, once wore the other person's body. It's a whole thing. Anyway, they're separate now, and it's a thing. So it's a lot of X-Men history there that sort of like pays off. Yeah, a nice opening salvo, I want to say. Very, very cool. I do want to mention that I did read Jupiter's Legacy Volume 1 by Mark Millar. It's another one of those superhero type stories that have a darker turn, and then there's superheroes from like the past, and now their children are sort of superheroes now too, and then there's a conspiracy.
I was like, that's a lot of the
I have to
things.
reread it again because it just felt it just didn't land, I want to say, as well in my psyche as I thought I would have. So this is definitely something that I'm trying to give another shot, because it's Mark Millar, and I like Mark Millar stuff. And this was turned into like a Netflix series.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
I didn't know that.
So there's a lot of goodwill in terms of, you know, that I should like this, but it just didn't sort of land. So I will probably reread it again.
All right, I got it. I got you.
Right. Anyway, so
That's fair.
That's my deal.
I did a lot of rereading again this month. I'm going to throw in that I reread Prisoner of Azkaban.
Sure.
That was fun. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. Like, it's funny because when I was younger, I would have said, like, Prisoner of Azkaban wasn't necessarily one of the books I enjoyed the most in the Harry Potter series, but the older I get, the more I'm like, yeah, this book is great.
It's my one of my favorites, actually.
It's such a pivotal turning point for that series.
Oh boy.
So
yeah,
it's quite enjoyable. Still hasn't eclipsed my favorite, which I have not reread yet this year, but you know. I also reread, continuing on with the Sarah J. Maas train, I also reread Heir of Fire.
Heir of
Third
Fire.
book in the series. I know a lot of people consider this their favorite book, and I can see why, because again, it's another one where it's the third book in the series. It is also a pivotal turning point for the series.
It is 100% a turning point.
And I appreciate it greatly for that. However, it is actually not one of my favorite books in the series. So, unlike most people, for me, this is actually like, it's good, and I appreciate it for what it is, but it's not necessarily a favorite. But I was glad to re-experience it again this year. And then I also reread 2 books in the Once Upon a Con series. So I reread Geekerella, and I reread The Princess and the Fangirl. So
that's cute.
Geekerella is sort of a modern day Cinderella story where the main character is a blogger. She writes this post criticizing the casting choice for a reboot of her favorite TV series franchise into a movie. She especially criticizes the lead character in that, Carmen Dor, the actor, and her cross paths at this con, and there's a whole Cinderella story moment in it. Quite enjoyable. I enjoyed it even more in a reread. Like, honestly, there's just something about the Cinderella story formula and the way that Ashley Poston wrote it that really works for me. The Princess and the Fangirl, on the other hand, is sort of like an identity switching book where the 2 main characters end up switching places because they look exactly alike. And they sort of learn more about themselves and each other in the process, and it helps them come to the point where they get to at the end of the book. I actually enjoyed that one more in a reread. The first time I read it, I liked it, but I didn't necessarily feel very strongly about it, but this time I was like, oh, I do find this more relatable. I like the characters a lot more, so it was fun to revisit that. Okay, now we're gonna talk about like newer books that I read. So first is a sequel, and that is A Queen Comes to Power. This is the second book in the An Heir Comes to Rise series. And going into this one, being more familiar with the author's writing style and also having a basic knowledge of the world and the lore and like seeing familiar faces again, all of this, and in addition to this, additional layers being woven into the story, like, it was just great. Like, I enjoyed this book even more than the first book in the series. I loved seeing everything get ramped up. It's just so satisfying when the second book in the series just like escalates everything from the first book. Like, it's just so satisfying as a reader to get that, and then to also feel like it escalates it, but you also still have room for even more escalation.
Oh, yeah.
Like,
yeah.
So fascinating. And obviously this was the book that pretty much cemented like, hey, I'm gonna be reading this series. Like, you can't stop me now.
Oh,
so yeah. Then I read Portrait of a Thief by Grace D. Lee. This is basically a bunch of college students led by one particular person, Will Chen. He gathers them all together in order to perform some heists to steal back some Chinese artwork from a variety of museums. They're being funded by a very big financial company. This one, I was hoping for more of a heisty vibe to it, but it actually isn't quite that. It's more character study versus heists. And I ended up finding it surprisingly compelling. In hindsight, it's funny because I even said this in my review. I was like, considering the title, I should have realized that it was less heist and more about the people doing the heisting, you know? It's pretty well paced, and I like that it switches point of views between the characters after particularly short chapters. Like, on the one hand, that makes it hard for you to get invested right away in any particular character, but on the other hand, it keeps your interest because you're just like, oh, I need to find out more about this person. I need to find out more about that person. What is really interesting is that there's a breakdown in how each of these characters view their histories, the heists that they're going on, and their thoughts about China and being Chinese and their futures. I like that there's sort of like a raw honesty to the way that's written, and that I'm sure will resonate with a lot of readers. While this didn't necessarily end up being like the book for me, like it wasn't necessarily a new favorite or anything, I did think it was very interesting. And then I read a book by an author a lot of people are going to find familiar, and that is Holly Black. I read
Holly Black.
Book of Night, which is her adult debut novel. Apparently it is the first in the series now. I was under the impression at first that it was going to be a standalone. It is not. In the main character's world, Charlie Hall, shadows can be altered. And this is both for entertainment and cosmetic purposes, but it can also give you extra power and influence because it can alter your feelings, it can alter memories, but obviously there is a cost because it's going to take, I think, some time off your life. Charlie is particularly notorious for being a con artist who's very good at stealing things. She's trying to get away from that life, and then she ends up getting drawn back into it because someone from her past shows up and kind of drags her back into it. I went into this one knowing that some people were not enjoying it. I do think that it is a solid adult fantasy like series starter because the plot was pretty compelling, and I do think that the way she set up the world and the lore is pretty interesting too. The hard part for me is that I didn't particularly care about our main character. Instead of being driven to read this because I was interested in Charlie and how the story would play out for her, for me it was more like I just wanted to see where the plot was going to go, and I'm pretty satisfied with where it ended, so I actually don't feel the need to continue. Another one where I'd be like, definitely check content warnings because there are some things that you might not want to read about. It was fine. Like, nothing particularly standard, but it was fine. For our book club this month, my sister decided we were going to read a thriller type book, mystery thriller. So we read The Last Mrs. Parrish. This book is about a young woman named Amber, and she is ambitious and determined to manipulate the situation so that she can get the ideal life she wants, which is basically to be the wife of a wealthy man, and she has her sights set on a particular one who is technically already married, but she's got a plan. Things kind of ensue from there. I don't read a lot of thrillers, so for me, like, reading this one was interesting because I feel like it's exactly the kind of book that I would want to read in this genre, I guess.
Okay,
even though the elements are fairly typical of this type of story, I was still surprised at certain turns, which is always a cool thing when I'm reading books like this one. The writing is very readable, the chapters are short, other than just being compelled to see how it would all play out. And even though I was rooting for a particular character too, which I think also helps with the mystery thrillers, I liked it. Okay, I think I liked it better than the others for the most part, but you know, it's fairly basic fare. Not something I would have searched out on my own, but not something I regret reading either. Again, also content warnings for this one either. And now I get to turn it over to Becky.
awesome. So I had, for a couple of Christmases ago, the entire sort of like Bella Alita box set. The manga, sort of like deluxe edition, had like a really cool sort of like hardbound type deal. Never really did end up reading it after I enjoyed thoroughly the sort of like the American live action sort of like release.
Oh yeah.
So yeah, one of the few sort of like US to a movie sort of interpretations of a manga and slash anime that I feel sort of did particularly well visually. Is at least very stunning. Like it was definitely on the mark.
Sure.
Story wise, probably debatable, but I liked it anyway. So I read the whole thing, blitzed through it.
Always is a good sign, actually.
And it's a sprawling epic saga. I wouldn't even call it like like if it were set more in actual space, it would be a space opera. But it is set on sort of like random planets. You get to really understand sort of like the history of just how this one battle angel ended up where she was, and sort of like the heart behind her finding herself is basically what the sci-fi genre is. It's when a machine becomes self-aware, right?
Yeah.
Or in Alita's case, when there is a consciousness to begin with, right?
Yeah.
It's not like, I'm suddenly like, it's more like, no, we have like emotion. Where do you go from there, right? And so that was sort of great. And I recommend it. I mean, it's the height of, you know, sort of like 70s Japanese cyberpunk, you know what I mean? And a little bit more hopeful than, say, for example, Ghost in the Shell. I say hopeful like the terrible things didn't happen, but they did. But I do feel like there is a bit of levity in terms of at least there's some light at the end of the tunnel versus it's just a crappy world and good luck figuring it out. Speaking of crappy worlds that they're figuring out, Once in Future, Volume 3 by Kieran Gillen. For everybody's reference, Once in Future.
I feel like that's so familiar, but I can't remember.
This is the dude. This starts out with a dude who just sort of like an average Joe, and his grandmother. Yeah, and his grandmother.
I was like, I knew it.
Happens to be sort of like a sort of like a demon hunter of sorts, and in this world,
respect, Grandma.
Right, mad respect. And so Arthurian legends ensue, right? But in this world, Arthurian legend archetypes and stories and fairy tales sort of tend to recreate themselves in the lives of other people. So there will be a new Galahad, there will be a new Lancelot, there will be a new this. And depending on what the story was, it's going to recreate itself as something like a, you know, an existential pattern into the sort of like modern world. So I like that there's this old pattern, it's going to recreate itself in the new world and have all of the new world's nuances that it didn't have in the previous. So that was great, super cool. And last but certainly not least, which I really did appreciate because I loved the story. So these are the last two books in the Arian Wynn sort of like series. Arian Wynn so this is by James Nichol. This is A Witch Alone and A Witch Come True. And it's basically in that little subgenre of little magical girls who are just struggling to make, you know, her the way in the world. And Arian Wynn moves to a little town that she's supposed to be the new witch, but people don't believe in her at first, and then they very Kiki's delivery service, and then but she has no choice but to sort of like prove herself. But then something larger and more terrible actually manifests itself, sort of like in the nearby woods, and it is up to Arian Wynn to sort of like sort things out because she discovers something new that no other person has sort of discovered. Her dad sort of comes into the mix as well, who's a little iffy about, well, you know, what do I do with this? Then my daughter's like, you know, her dad's a soldier. So there's a lot of character-driven stuff amidst a pretty rich sort of like world. So if you like little magical girl, like finding Kiki's Delivery Service kind of books, this is pretty much where Alexa and I live. So it is what it is.
You're not wrong.
I am not wrong. Okay, turning it over to you now.
Okay, my turn. I'm going to end with 3 more books. The first of which is The Roughest Draft, which is by Emily Wibberley and Austin Siegemund Roca.
Aren't they all?
So this book is about 2 co-authors. They were a very successful writing pair until an incident like years ago forced them to separate, and they never really publicly talk about what the incident was. They're just not on good terms. Cut to, it's years later, and because of personal circumstances and professional circumstances, they're forced back together to work on another novel, and it sort of unravels everything, all of the secrets and the feelings and the issues that they've been having. I'll preface this by saying I have seen mixed reviews for this and I understand why. The cover kind of gives you the vibe that it's going to be a fluffy rom-com read, which this book is definitely not that. It examines a very complicated relationship between these 2 co-authors who clearly have something going on between them. It's really messy, it's really hard to read at times, and it's because the way that the feelings are written or like conveyed feels super raw. The writing is super readable, but the feelings that come across so raw. It feels cathartic, I guess, in some ways, frustrating in other ways, but like it never stopped being compelling for me. Like I like, it's a weird thing to say, but I enjoy reading books where the authors try to examine relationships and the different aspects of them. Sometimes it can be interesting to examine how a relationship starts or forms. And in the case of this book, it was actually interesting to watch how it breaks down and reforms. Like it's just interesting. It reminded me a little bit of like early Taylor Jenkins Reid, a little bit of Emily Henry. I really liked it. I'm glad I read it. So I personally would recommend this one. I enjoyed it, but just go into it knowing it's not a rom-com. It's not a rom-com. I will emphasize that again. It is not a rom-com.
No.
Worth saying 3 times.
Absolutely.
The next book I'm going to talk about is actually more of a rom-com. And that is Something Wilder, which is by Christina Lauren. Lily Wilder is our main character. She's basically the daughter of a treasure hunter named Duke Wilder, and she ends up getting left not much in the bank, and so she's pretty resourceful and she wants to keep her family ranch that they own, and so to do so she's trying to make enough money to buy it back outright. Right now, her career path is that she is using her dad's sort of treasure maps to take people out on an adventure. And it just so happens that one of her exes ends up taking this adventure because his best friend ends up booking it for them without telling him what it was.
Right.
And so Leo, and that's the name of the guy, they cross paths again, but then shenanigans ensue, which is my favorite thing to say when it comes to books like this one. I had so much fun reading this book. It was just like one of those things where it helped me escape the real world for a little bit, and it gave me a story that was super entertaining. Like, think Lost City, kind of. That's the vibe a little bit. Like, it's the same energy,
Sandra Bullock,
really.
Channing Tatum.
Yeah. I really rooted for the main couple. I could sense their chemistry right away, which is always a promising thing. You do have to suspend your disbelief a bit. It's, again, like Lost City. Like, you know going into Lost City, the movie, that, like, there are going to be aspects of that movie where, like, they're ridiculously over the top. And the same thing is true of this book. But honestly, I was just happy to do that, suspend my disbelief and just let the book play out as it would. It gets wild, for sure. Not just to play on the title, it does get wild. But it was nice because at the end of it, I just felt warm and fuzzy and satisfied. And it was exactly what I wanted at the time I read it, which is why it deserves a spot in this section of the video.
Awesome.
The last book, in complete contrast, is back to angsty romance. This time it's angsty YA romance. And that is Some Mistakes Were Made by Kristen Dwyer. So this is a book about Ellis and Easton. There is an incident in their past that has caused them to be separated. Ellis is forced to move halfway across the country, away from the hometown she's known and lived in all her life, and the sort of found family she has there, including Easton. I'm gonna leave it at that. The book jumps timelines. You see moments from the past, you see moments in the present, and it's sort of these characters in the present coming to terms with all of the things that happened in the past. It's such a well-written book. Like, I had high hopes for it, and it honestly lived up to those hopes. Readers are invited to get to know Ellis very intimately, to sort of witness like her very complicated and conflicted emotions with her family situation and with the people around her or who surround her. You also end up falling in love with the same family she ends up falling in love with and becoming a part of, the Albrys. Like, they really take her in and sort of make her one of them in a way, and it's just like, I loved reading that too. It's so clever to see how everything comes together, how it all falls apart. I think the construction of that was also really well done because the dual timeline really like heightens the emotional experience of that. And the ending, so satisfying in terms of being cathartic, but also like warm and fuzzy, I guess is the right term.
That's a good term.
I personally would recommend picking up this book to check it out, especially if you are into young adult, sort of bordering new adult, like angsty, complicated, messy romance stories. So
love that.
Really good. Anyway, those are all the books that we want to talk about for the month of April. If you have any thoughts, feelings, questions, concerns, feel free to leave them down in the comments section below, and we will talk to you guys soon. Bye!
Bye.